One of the fond memories I have growing up was when my family would sit around the television and watch the Flip Wilson Show. For those who are unaware, the Flip Wilson Show aired in the early 1970s. One of Wilson's most famous skits was when he dressed as a character known as Geraldine Jones. It was from Geraldine Jones where Wilson's most famous catchphrase came, "The devil made me do it." Although exaggerated by Geraldine Jones, the belief that the devil can influence people is not an uncommon one among Christians. Some Christians believe Satan influences us by exposing us to temptations that are difficult to handle. Some claim that Satan can put thoughts into our minds, and others claim that individuals can even be possessed by the devil. Justification for each of these beliefs can be found in the New Testament. Although this is the picture that the New Testament paints, we don't find this in the Old Testament. As I indicated in the previous video, the Old Testament shows that God is the ultimate cause of evil. It was God who commanded the destroyer to kill the firstborn sons of the Egyptians. It was God who put a lying spirit into the mouth of the prophets. So if God causes evil, where did Satan come from? Before I discuss where Satan came from, let me show you where Satan didn't come from. There are three Old Testament passages Christians often cite when talking about Satan. The first, of course, is in Genesis chapter 3, which I addressed in my last video. Now I'd like to discuss Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. Isaiah 14:12 says, "How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn! How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low." The King James Version of the Bible translates day star as Lucifer, the name that Christians have historically attributed to Satan. In this passage, the day star states that he will ascend to heaven and that he will make himself like the Most High. However, instead of this happening, the day star was brought down to Sheol, a place where the dead go. Christians believe this passage describes the fall of Satan. Because Satan tried to make himself equal with God, he was cast out of heaven. However, when we carefully read the passage, it's easy to determine that the author is not writing about Satan. First of all, in verse 3, the subject is clearly identified as the king of Babylon. In verses 6 and 7, the subject is identified as a man. In verses 9, 11, 16, and 19, the subject is said to be dead. And in verse 20, the subject is said to have destroyed his land and killed his people. It is obvious from reading this passage that it is not referring to Satan. A second passage often associated with Satan is Ezekiel 28. Verse 13 says, "You were in Eden, the garden of God." The passage goes on to describe the subject as being an anointed guardian cherub and blameless in his ways. You might say that this has to refer to Satan, but it really doesn't. Flowery language like this was often used to describe ancient kings. If you actually read the passage without a bias that it is Satan, you will discover that this isn't Satan that's being described. Just like in Isaiah, the subject is named in the passage. In verse 11, it identifies the subject as the king of Tyre. Some say that the greatest evidence that the passage refers to Satan is because the subject is described as being in Eden. This, some say, couldn't possibly be referring to the king of Tyre. But if we examine the text, it becomes obvious as to why this statement was made. Ezekiel 28:18 says, "By the multitude of your iniquities, in the unrighteousness of your trade, you profaned your sanctuaries." The key part of this verse is that the subject participated in unrighteous trade. Now with whom did the king of Tyre trade? This can be found in Ezekiel 27:23. Here we find that the king traded with Eden. Hence, we can say that he was in Eden, the garden of God. It's important to note that the association of these passages with Satan didn't occur until the 3rd and 4th century AD. Additionally, Judaism doesn't associate these passages with Satan. When one ignores Christian tradition and reads the passages for what they say, we can safely conclude that neither Isaiah or Ezekiel reference Satan. Now that we've addressed passages that don't have anything to do with Satan, let's discuss who Satan is and his role in Judaism. The Hebrew word for Satan is Satan, which means to obstruct, to oppose, to accuse, or to be an adversary. The verb Satan only occurs 6 times in the Old Testament, mostly in the book of Psalms. As a noun, Satan is found 26 times in the Old Testament. In 7 of those instances, it is used to describe a human being. For instance, the Philistines describe David as an adversary or Satan in 1 Samuel 29:4. In the 19 other references, Satan refers to a supernatural being, including an account in Numbers. Numbers contains probably the most overlooked example of a supernatural being acting as a Satan. In Numbers chapter 22, the Jews were camped in the plains of Moab. Balak, the king of Moab, saw that the Jews had easily defeated the Amorites and was afraid. So he called for a prophet named Balaam to curse the Jews. Balak believed that if Balaam cursed the Jews, he would be able to defeat them in battle. After being approached by some elders and princes of Moab to perform the curse, Balaam was visited by God on 2 occasions. In one visit, God told Balaam not to go, but in a second visit, he told Balaam he could go. Now, as Balaam was on his way, verse 22 says, "But God's anger was kindled because he went, and the angel of the Lord took his stand in the way as his adversary. Now he was riding on the donkey, and his 2 servants were with him." The word that has been translated as adversary is the word Satan. Here, the angel of the Lord was acting as a Satan to hinder Balaam. Although Balaam didn't see the angel at first, the donkey he was riding on did and turned to avoid the angel. This happened 3 times, each time resulting in Balaam striking his donkey with a staff. After the 3rd instance, the angel opened the donkey's mouth and it spoke to Balaam, like donkeys do. Finally, Balaam's eyes were opened and he saw the angel, which said, "Why have you struck your donkey these 3 times? Behold, I have come out to oppose you, because your way is perverse before me." In this verse, to oppose has been translated from the word Satan. So in Numbers, it was an angel of God who was playing the role of an adversary, an opposer, a Satan. Satan is mentioned by name in 3 books of the Old Testament, Job, Zechariah, and 1 Chronicles. I'd like to look at the evolution of the Satan myth using these books. I'm going to address them in this order because, chronologically, this is the order in which most scholars believe they were written. The book of Job contains the oldest and most famous account of Satan. Here he is referenced not as Satan but as Hasatan, which literally means the Satan or the accuser. In Job, Hasatan is the angel of God. He is part of God's divine counsel. Hasatan isn't his name, but rather his role or title. He is the accuser. Hasatan doesn't operate on his own, but only at the direction of God. He isn't the enemy of God, but works directly for God, just like the angel did in the story of Balaam. Hasatan inflicts suffering on Job, but only at the direction of God. A second instance where Satan is named can be found in Zechariah chapter 3, which says, "Then he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. And the Lord said to Satan, The Lord rebuke you, O Satan. The Lord who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is not this brand plucked from the fire?" Once again in this passage, Satan is referred to as Hasatan. And, just like in Job, Hasatan is acting as an accuser. Now there is some disagreement about the specifics of this passage. Some indicate that this is just a continuation of Hasatan's role in Job as the accuser. He still works for God and doesn't oppose God. However, some have suggested that this is the beginning of a shift for Hasatan. Notice that the Lord rebukes him here. He seems to have overstepped his bounds. Some believe that Zechariah shows a different role for Hasatan. No longer does he work for God, but begins to act independently from God. The third occurrence where Satan is named is found in 1 Chronicles 21. In verse 1 it says, "Then Satan stood up against Israel and incited David to number Israel." 1 Chronicles 21:1 is the first and only reference to Satan in the Old Testament which doesn't have the direct article ha. Instead of being Hasatan, the being is referenced by the proper name, Satan. In this verse, Satan incites David to take a census. From reading the story, a census was viewed as a bad thing. Now, although there is disagreement among scholars as to why a census was bad, there is no disagreement that taking the census was definitely viewed as bad or evil. An older version of the same account can be found in 2 Samuel 24:1, which says, "Again the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, Go, number Israel and Judah." Here we seem to have discovered a contradiction in Scripture. The older account of the story shows God as inciting David to perform the census, and the newer account shows that it was Satan. So what's going on here? Well, once again we have a couple of different theories, similar theories to those shared on the Zechariah 3 passage. The first theory states that there really isn't a contradiction here. When assuming that God is the ultimate cause of evil, the 2 Samuel account can easily be harmonized with the 1 Chronicles account. 2 Samuel shows it was God who incited David, and 1 Chronicles shows how he incited David, which was through Hasatan. Just like in Job, where God used Hasatan to inflict suffering on Job, God also used Hasatan to incite David to take a census. The second theory states that since the 1 Chronicles account is newer, it shows an evolution of the Satan being. Here the being isn't Hasatan, but someone who is working independently from God with the proper name, Satan. Since taking a census was an evil act, sophisticated individuals felt uncomfortable blaming God for the evil. Therefore, the 1 Chronicles account blamed Satan instead. This theory states that, at this point, it was Satan who was the cause of evil, not God. Although I tend to side with the second theory that Satan evolved to be the cause of evil, it's impossible to know for sure if that was the intent. However, even if this passage wasn't intended to show Satan being the cause of evil, it's easy to see how individuals could interpret it that way, especially if they were looking. And perhaps it was this idea which people over the centuries used to create the view we have of Satan today. In the next video, I will continue my discussion of the evolution of the Satan myth by examining books written during the intertestamental period. Take care and let me know what you think.